Hello everyone. So let's go ahead and let's do some more factoring review. But now we're going to use the quadratic formula. Now, what is the quadratic formula? Let's go ahead and let's write that down. So the quadratic formula is when x is equal to negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, and all of this gets divided by 2 times a. Now, when do we use this? We use this when we are trying to solve a quadratic equation. So what you see up here is a quadratic equation, and it's already been set equal to 0. If you notice that you have a quadratic, but it has not been set equal to 0 on one side, make sure that you move terms to the left or the right side by doing the opposite operations on both sides of the equation until we finally have 0 on one side. And then once we do that, then all we need to do is we need to take a, b, and c, all three of these values, and substitute it directly into the quadratic formula. And then, of course, we're going to just evaluate, and then finally we would get our two solutions for x at the very end. Now, keep in mind that the quadratic formula can actually be used no matter what kind of quadratic equation you have. So if you don't know whether or not you can use the magic x, it's okay to go ahead and use the quadratic formula, because at the end of the day, it always works, and we will always get to the same answer as well. Let's go ahead and let's use this in an example. All right, so in this example one here, they want us to factor and solve the following equation. It says 2x squared minus 4x is equal to a positive 3. Now, as I'm looking at this equation here, I notice that we almost have a quadratic. We have an x squared term, I have an x term, and I have a number, except it's on the other side of the equation. So in order for us to use the quadratic formula, or even factoring at all, we need to make sure that we set our equation equal to 0. And how we'll do that is by subtracting 3 on both sides, because when we do that, 3 minus 3 is 0 on the right side of the equation, just like we wanted. Now, because that minus 3 is an unlike term with all of the other terms that we currently have, we're just going to write it separately. So 2x squared minus 4x minus 3. Okay, now taking a look at this here, we could try to use the magic x, where you take the a value, 2, and you multiply it with the c value, negative 3. Our dilemma here, though, is that if you were to multiply this, we would get a negative 6. And unfortunately, none of the factors for negative 6 will add to give us a negative 4. So the magic x is not going to help us out here. But what will help us out is the quadratic formula. So let's go ahead and let's write it down. X is equal to, because again, we use this to solve for x. It's going to be negative b plus or minus the square root of b squared minus 4 times a times c, and all of this gets divided by 2 times a. Where do these values come from? Again, they come from our quadratic expression. So a is going to be 2. B is going to be a negative 4, because there's a minus sign in front of that 4. And c here is going to be a negative 3. So we need to make sure that we substitute in appropriately. So let's go ahead and do exactly that. X is equal to negative b. Now, keep in mind that this negative is a part of the formula. So I do need to write down that negative, but what I'm substituting in for b is an entire negative 4. So there is actually a double negative going on here, because this negative comes from the formula or the equation, and this negative comes from the value that we substituted in. So make sure that when we're substituting in for any of these values, if there's a negative, make sure that you add it in because there might be a double negative. All right, so we're going to go ahead and continue on. Plus or minus the square root of b squared, which is that negative 4 squared. And I do have to make sure I write this in parentheses because this is not 4 squared. This is not 4 squared, and then you multiply by a negative. We're taking negative 4 and we are multiplying it with another negative 4. All right, minus 4 times the value for A, which is 2, times the value for C, which is a negative 3. Take a look at that. There is another negative. Make sure that you substitute it in with parentheses. And all of this gets divided, of course, by 2 times the value for A, which is another 2. All right, now I know this looks a little crazy when you're trying to evaluate, so let's kind of try to go through a process here. What you want to focus on first is evaluating or working inside of the square root. And then after you work inside the square root, then we can go ahead and take a look at everything else on the outside. So, taking a look at what is inside our square root, go ahead and just forget everything else on the outside for now. On the inside of the square root, we have a negative 4 squared. Again, this is negative 4 times negative 4, and this gives us a positive 16. Now, I see that there's a minus sign here in front of the 4, so I'm going to just carry it down here for now so I don't have to worry about it. And I'm going to treat this 4 like a positive and multiply it with the A and C values. So 4 times 2 is a positive 8, but 8 times a negative 3 becomes a negative 24. So when I substitute in, or when I write down the value, I need to make sure that I write it as a negative 24, like so. Once more, this negative is down here because it comes from the minus sign in front of the 4, but the second negative in front of the 24 comes from our negative 3. All right, now that we have concentrated on the inside of the square root, let's go ahead and focus on what's outside of that. Putting all of this back underneath the square root, of course. I had that plus or minus in the front. And I have a negative 4, which turns this into a positive 4. All of this gets divided by, now I can see what's in the denominator. It was 2 times 2. And so 2 times 2 is a 4 in the denominator here. And all of this, of course, is equal to x because that's what we're solving for. All right, so now, just like before, we're going to go ahead and focus once more inside the square root and simplify this as much as we can. So, inside the square root, 16 minus a negative 24 becomes 16 plus 24. All of that is still, of course, inside the square root, and I'm still plus or minusing that 4 in the beginning, all divided by positive 4, and this is equal to x. All right. Last step here for the inside of the square root, 16 plus 24 gives me a 40. And I haven't done anything else with the numbers on the outside, so they kind of just come along. And the very last thing that I need to consider here is to simplify the square root. Now, if you don't remember how to simplify the square root, I'm going to link a video down below where I show you examples of how to simplify square roots. Feel free to take a look at that video if you need a review. But I'm going to go ahead and skip straight to the simplified form. The square root of 40 should become 2 times the square root of 10. And everything else has remained the same because I haven't done anything with it. All right, so we are almost done. There's one last step we need to take care of, which is to ask ourselves, is it possible to further simplify our answer? What we look at is all of the terms in the numerator and the value in the denominator. And we ask ourselves, do or is there a common factor for all of these? In other words, is there a common factor for 4, 2, and the 4 in the denominator? And the answer is yes. Every single one of these values is divisible by 2. So what we're going to do is we are going to go ahead and divide each of these by 2. So 4 divided by 2 is a 2. 2 divided by 2 is a 1. And 4 divided by 2 is a 2 in the denominator. And so my final answer looks like this. 2 plus or minus the square root of 10. And yes, I don't need to write that number 1 because just like the coefficient for x, there's an invisible 1 standing out here in the front. All of this gets divided by 2. And this right here is our final answer or final solution for x. The reason why we cannot further simplify is because, again, when we simplify, we need to make sure that we look for common factors for all of the values in the denominator and the numerator. So this 2, this 1, and this 2. And so because the 1 is not divisible by 2, this right here is our final simplified answer. All right, so just kind of to sum everything up, it is a lot of evaluating, but again, focus on the inside of the square root first. Take care of that, and then deal with whatever on the outside. And then once you've finished on the inside of the square root, make sure to double check to make sure that you simplified the square root itself all the way. It might not be possible, but sometimes it is. And then last but not least, see if it's possible to simplify all of the values for every term. In other words, look for a common factor between the numerator and the denominator. All right, so go ahead and pause the video here and see if you can give this one a try on your own. All right, so go ahead and double check over your answers. Now, I just want to pull your attention to a few quick areas. The first one is going to be when you are working inside the square root here, remember to just bring this negative down, the subtraction symbol down, so you don't have to worry about it and just treat this 4 like a positive 4. Because here, when we finish multiplying, we actually end up with a negative 16. So substitute that in, of course, with parentheses, and this will, of course, change to be a plus 16. So that's the first area that I wanted you to kind of focus your attention in the event that you got the answer wrong. And then also make sure that when you finish evaluating inside the square root, double check to make sure that you can or cannot simplify this square root. In this particular case, 52, square root of 52 can be simplified into 2 times the square root of 13. And then the last area you want to double check is to see if all of our values in the numerator and the denominator, if they have a common factor, and in fact they do. Negative 6 and 2 are divisible by 2. So we get a 1, which is why we don't see a number in front of the square root of 13. And because our denominator is 1, I don't need to write it over 1, or I don't need to divide by 1, because it's going to be the exact same answer. So negative 3 plus or minus the square root of 13 is our final answer. All right, so that is it for this video. Thank you very much for watching.